Merlin Maggie Rope, known to her neighbors as Mrs. Harper, was the kind of elderly woman most people overlooked. At 74, her stooped posture and calm tone of voice gave the impression of fragility. Inside her son's home, this appearance became an invitation to exploitation. Her daughter-in-law never missed an opportunity to treat her like a sort of unpaid maid. She asked her to wash dishes even after long visits, made caustic comments about the earthy smell Maggie brought in from the garden, and criticized her clothes as signs of neglect. To outsiders, it seemed like nothing more than a difficult coexistence between generations, but those who lived through it knew that the line between coexistence and humiliation had long since been crossed. The son, who should have been her safe haven, preferred to stay by his wife's side in every situation. It didn't matter if his mother was tired, had just returned from a doctor's appointment, or needed help carrying heavy bags. He looked at her with disdain, repeating cutting phrases like, "Don't be dramatic," or "You look like you're an attention seeker." Maggie, who had once dreamed of growing old surrounded by respect and family love, discovered daily how cruel old age could be when dignity was stolen within one's own home. And yet, she didn't defend herself. Her silence, which to others was a sign of submission, was actually part of something no one could have imagined. The insults came in various forms. The daughter-in-law Maggie's care for her small backyard vegetable garden, saying that nobody of any standing messed with tomato plants. Other times, she insinuated that her mother-in-law's antique furniture was worthless junk, ignoring that each piece carried the story of a lifetime spent with her husband. There was also veiled cruelty. During Maggie's brief hospitalization, her daughter-in-law rented out her room online, welcoming tourists without even asking permission. When Maggie returned home, she found her belongings stacked in boxes, as if she were merely a temporary tenant. That was the day something changed inside her forever. Maggie had never been one for direct confrontation. From a young age, she had learned to deal with problems with patience and calculation. When she lost her husband, this trait intensified. The life insurance she had received seemed, at first glance, merely cold compensation for his absence. But for her, it became the key to a quiet opportunity. She sought out a childhood friend, now a financial professional, and together they set up a trust. It was a risky move, but Maggie approached it with equanimity. She knew that true power lay in acting without others' notice. Meanwhile, inside the house, the provocations intensified. The son and daughter-in-law began talking openly about a large real estate project, quoting figures and flaunting plans before her as if she were a mute extra. One night, Maggie overheard her daughter-in-law, with a cynical smile, comment to friends, "Her only use will be to sign the papers we need. Then we'll decide her fate." Collective laughter echoed through the room, but Maggie remained impassive. Inside, however, she treasured every word, like pieces of a puzzle that would soon be completed. The pressure didn't stop there. On another occasion, her son presented her with an irrevocable power of attorney, saying it was just a formality. His tone was authoritative, almost threatening. When Maggie asked why, she heard the phrase she never forgot, "Sign it, or we'll put you in a nursing home." It's simple. That could have destroyed anyone else in her position. But for Maggie, it served as confirmation that she was on the right track. She didn't sign, made excuses, and discreetly called her lawyer friend. With each new threat, her conviction grew stronger. Behind the scenes, the trust grew. Investments in stocks, strategic acquisitions, and, most importantly, the silent purchase of a stake in the construction company, responsible for the $64 million project. Maggie, from her remaining bedroom, followed reports, read documents, and held discreet meetings over the phone while pretending to sew or watch television. The contrast was almost ironic. While her daughter-in-law saw her as a useless old woman, Maggie became one of the project's most influential shareholders, all this without arousing suspicion. Secrecy was her greatest weapon. The months passed, and the couple sank into arrogance. They planned grand parties to inaugurate the new property, acting like owners even before the purchase was finalized. Maggie observed everything silently, never interrupting but recording every detail. Even the humiliations became fuel. She discreetly recorded conversations, saved messages, and collected evidence. The turning point was near, and Maggie knew there would be no need to shout, argue, or despair. They just had to wait for the right moment, and their truth would speak louder than any insult. The couple believed they were in complete control of the situation. In conversations with friends, they described Maggie as a burden and even as a problem soon to be solved. The daughter-in-law often commented that once the purchase was finalized, Maggie would be well taken care of in a specialized facility. Words spoken with a coldness that hid contempt. Her son, for his part, didn't disagree. On the contrary, he reinforced that it was best for everyone. They didn't realize that with each sentence, they fueled Maggie's conviction. This wasn't just cruelty. It was proof that she needed to act, not just for herself, but for so many other forgotten women. In weekly meetings with her childhood friend, Maggie reviewed documents and checked the acquired shares. Everything was done in an organized manner, without rushing or slipping up. Her friend, who had known her since she was a child, was impressed by Maggie's coolness and clarity of thought. "You've always had this strategic mind. You just never had to use it this way," she said in one of the meetings. Maggie just smiled. There was no room for vanity or blind revenge. What she was building was justice, not just for herself, but as a legacy of resistance. With each new step taken by the construction company, Maggie was already one step ahead. When her son boasted about negotiations with brokers and investors, she already knew exactly who would sign the final contracts with her. This duplicity was what strengthened her most. At home, she continued to play the role of the submissive elderly woman, carrying dishes, enduring malicious laughter, and feigning distraction. But in the silence of her bedroom, she was a different person, firm, calculating, and in control. This contrast was, in itself, a victory. The pressure mounted when the couple brought lawyers into the house, trying to convince her that it was all bureaucracy. One such meeting ended with the daughter-in-law pushing Maggie aside, pushing her chair into the corner of the room as if it were an object. Lawyers, investors, and guests watched in awkward silence, but no one intervened. Maggie calmly stood up, straightened her coat, and said nothing. While everyone saw submission, she saw opportunity. Every witness that day would remember how she was treated, something that would carry weight in the future. Deep down, the son believed he knew his mother. He thought that after so many years of silence and a lifetime of domestic work, she would never dare confront him. This error in judgment was crucial. Maggie had never shown any clear signs of rebellion, never raised her voice against him. This blind trust in control was precisely what allowed her to act freely, without arousing suspicion. He didn't realize that the more he treated her as invisible, the more room she had to move unnoticed. Meanwhile, Maggie prepared the final blow. With her friend's help, she drafted a detailed, legally sound alternative contract that assigned the property to the Haven House Foundation, a shelter for abandoned elderly women. Every clause was precisely written. Nothing could be reversed. More than a financial transaction, it was a symbolic gesture, transforming her personal pain into protection for others in similar situations. She knew that when the day of signing arrived, there would be no turning back. The days leading up to the final meeting were silent, but filled with internal tension. The couple was euphoric, talking about the Avi housewarming party, the luxurious decor, the importance of having their surname on the property's facade. Maggie, listening from afar, simply watered her plants, cut sprigs of rosemary, and waited. Deep inside, she knew she was about to turn a page that would change not only her life but also everyone's image of her. For the first time, there was no fear, only certainty. The morning of the decisive meeting arrived. The couple woke early, dressed in formal attire, and wore smiles of conquest. Maggie, discreet as always, put on her old coat, tied her hair back, and walked silently to the car. Her daughter-in-law made a point of commenting, laughing, "At least you look presentable today." Her son remained silent, focused on his cell phone. Maggie didn't respond. Her mind was already on what was to come. As the car drove to the broker's office, she remained calm. She knew that this would be the day her invisibility would cease to exist. The office was packed that morning. Lawyers, brokers, investors, and some local figures awaited the formalization of the purchase. The atmosphere was celebratory for the couple, who behaved as if they already owned everything. The daughter-in-law smiled at everyone, introducing herself as the future owner, while her son walked with an inflated posture, shaking hands and making promises. Maggie was led to a corner, her chair pulled out almost abruptly, as if it were a formal obligation and not a central part of the meeting. No one imagined that everyone was there because of her. The documents were laid out on the table. The broker arranged the papers, explained technical details, and asked everyone to settle in so they could begin the signings. The impatient daughter-in-law looked at Maggie like someone waiting for a child to do their homework. "There, all that's left is for you to sign," she said harshly. The son coldly reinforced, "It's just a formality, Mom. Don't get in the way now." The silence that followed seemed to confirm everyone's expectations. The frail, resigned woman would obey. Maggie, however, took her time. Slowly, she adjusted her glasses, scanned the pages, and instead of signing, looked firmly at the broker. "I'd like to add a contract that should also be considered in this negotiation." The statement sounded like an anomaly, something too unexpected to ignore. The room, which had been noisy until then, fell into absolute silence. Her daughter-in-law laughed nervously. "She doesn't know what she's saying," she tried to explain, but Maggie was already pulling a folder from her bag. The couple's lawyer, surprised, received the papers and began reading. With each line, his expression changed. First disbelief, then astonishment, and finally respect. "This changes everything," he said firmly. The daughter-in-law approached to snatch the documents but was stopped by the real estate agent. The irritated son tried to intervene. "She doesn't have the authority to do that. She's just the final signatory." That's when Maggie, still calm, stood up and declared, "I'm the majority shareholder of the construction company responsible for this project, and the sole legal owner of the land on which you plan to build your illusions." The words fell like a weight in the air. Some present gasped, others widened their eyes. The broker, disconcerted, confirmed the information. Suddenly, the previously invisible figure revealed itself as the centerpiece of the table. The son paled, unable to react. The daughter-in-law, unsure whether to scream or try to laugh, lost control of her posture. The role reversal was instantaneous. Maggie was no longer the silent old woman. She was the holder of the power everyone craved. The realtor, trying to maintain formality, asked how to proceed. It was at that moment that Maggie handed over the alternative contract, prepared in advance. The document stipulated the entire donation of the property to the Haven House Foundation, an organization dedicated to caring for elderly women abandoned by their families. Her signature, made in front of everyone, sealed the decision. There were no legal loopholes, no room for reversal. The couple watched helplessly as their future crumbled before their eyes. What surprised everyone most was the serenity with which Maggie performed the act. There was no shouting, no accusations, no spectacle, just firmness and conviction. It was as if she had waited her whole life for this moment, and now she lived it with the precision of someone who calculated every detail. Her daughter-in-law tried to protest, saying it was unfair, but was interrupted by the lawyer, who reluctantly confirmed, "She has every right. Nothing can be done." The son sat silently, staring at the table. His face, once haughty, now reflected defeat. The words he had so often used against his mother seemed to weigh heavily on him. Maggie didn't look at him with hatred or resentment, only with the calm of someone who knew justice had been served. In that moment, the entire room understood. The woman everyone thought weak had never been submissive, only patient. When the meeting ended, the room was still in shock. Some investors stood discreetly, whispering among themselves, while others looked at Maggie with a mixture of respect and surprise. Her daughter-in-law, out of control, sputtered out confusing comments, trying to defuse the situation. Her son kept his head down, unable to meet his mother's gaze. For Maggie, that collective silence was more eloquent than any speech. The truth was there for all to see, and there was no turning back. The first signs of the scandal emerged that afternoon. News of the turnaround spread like wildfire among lawyers and brokers. Within hours, people were already talking in cafes and offices about the elderly woman who turned the tables on her own family. The detail of the donation to the foundation generated even more shock. Instead of enriching herself, Maggie had transformed the project into a social symbol. This directly hurt the couple's pride, which was already the subject of comments for its arrogant attitude in social circles. Maggie knew the revelation needed backing, so with the help of her lawyer, she released the recordings she'd made over the months. The audio clearly showed her daughter-in-law mocking the idea of sending the old lady to a nursing home as soon as the paperwork was signed. In other passages, her son coldly agreed, saying that it would be better for everyone if she disappeared. The material reached the local press, which was quick to publish reports on the story. The impact was devastating for the couple. Close friends, once so present at parties and gatherings, began to drift away. Investors who were planning partnerships immediately backed away, fearing the tarnishing of their reputations alongside such a disgraced couple. The image of power and status they so desperately sought crumbled within days. What was public shame, compounded by headlines splashed across newspapers and websites. 74-year-old woman exposes son and daughter-in-law in multi-million-dollar project. Inside the home, the change was even more brutal. The silence between the couple grew heavy, filled with mutual accusations. The daughter-in-law blamed her husband for not having controlled the situation, while he countered by saying it was she who underestimated his mother. Meanwhile, neighbors watched from afar. Visits disappeared and invitations to social events ceased completely. What they had built on appearances simply evaporated. Maggie, on the other hand, returned to a serene routine. She went back to tending the garden, watering tomatoes and lettuce as if nothing had happened. To her neighbors, she was now a figure of admiration. Some even knocked on her door to praise her courage, something Maggie received humbly. She had never sought applause, but the sense of restored dignity was enough. Every word of support served as a reminder that she was not alone, that others saw her as a role model. The cornered couple began to face financial difficulties. With the loss of investors and broken contracts, they had to sell luxury cars and drastically reduce their lifestyle. What had once been ostentation turned into quiet desperation. Attempts to restore their reputation failed as the recordings circulated freely, and no one wanted to associate with someone who spoke so contemptuously of their own family. With each passing day, they sank deeper into isolation. The most symbolic moment occurred months later, when, with no way out, someone knocked on Maggie's door. They arrived with their heads down, asking for shelter, claiming they had nowhere else to go. Maggie welcomed them calmly, listened in silence, and before closing the door, returned the very words she had heard so many times. "Maybe it's best if you look for a nursing home. It's simple." There was no anger in her voice, only firmness, and in that sentence, the entire cycle closed with precision. Maggie's calm refusal to shelter her son and daughter-in-law spread as quickly as the initial scandal. Neighbors whispered, but everyone knew what had happened. Many saw in that gesture the true closing of a cycle. It wasn't revenge in the cruel sense, but justice. Maggie had returned the contempt she had suffered in kind, but without losing her dignity. It was the first time in a long time that she felt fully in control of her own life. With the contract signed, the Haven House Foundation began working on the project it had received from Maggie. The property, once seen as a symbol of luxury and power for the couple, became a source of hope for dozens of women. Soon, the space began to be adapted to accommodate elderly women in situations of neglect, offering housing, medical care, and community activities. Seeing this happen gave Maggie the feeling that her suffering had been transformed into something greater and more useful. The press, which continued to follow the story, began to portray her as an example of resistance. Interviews were requested, but Maggie only accepted one, brief and to the point. In it, she simply said, "Silence is not weakness. Sometimes it's a strategy, and every woman has the right to dignity regardless of age." The phrase went viral, being repeated in newspapers, radio stations, and even in lectures on aging and social rights. Within the foundation, Maggie was welcomed as an inspiration. The women who arrived, many with similar stories of rejection, saw in her an example of courage. Some cried as they thanked her personally, saying they never imagined someone would have the strength to transform pain into opportunity for others. Maggie responded simply, remembering that life taught her to wait, observe, and act at the right moment. For her, this was the true meaning of survival. Meanwhile, her son and daughter-in-law were struggling with the weight of their downfall. They moved to a simple house in a remote neighborhood where no one knew them. They lived amidst arguments and frustrated attempts to restore their lost image. Maggie never heard from them again, but she knew they were paying the price for their choices. There was no satisfaction in seeing them suffer, only the certainty that each reaped what they sowed. Maggie's days once again revolved around her garden, teas shared with neighbors, and occasional visits to the foundation. Her life was not filled with luxury or ostentation, but rather with respect and peace. This was what she always wanted, to be treated not as a burden, but as a person. Each morning as she watered the garden, she remembered that it was patience, not desperation, that gave her the tools to turn things around. Some journalists tried to turn her story into a symbol of revenge, but Maggie didn't see herself that way. For her, what she did was simply defend herself against an injustice that had become unbearable. Her greatest pride was not her son's or daughter-in-law's defeat. but the fact that she had left something lasting, a shelter that would continue to function even when she was no longer there. That, indeed, was the real victory. Deep down, Maggie understood that life had given her a second chance to be remembered for who she truly was, a strong, strategic woman, capable of transforming silence into action. As she walked through the yard and picked a sprig of rosemary, she thought to herself that time always reveals who truly holds power. It's not who shouts the loudest, but who knows how to wait for the right moment. And she had finally proven this to the world. Over time, Maggie's name began to circulate in spaces she never imagined. Universities invited her to lecture on aging and autonomy, even though she preferred to stay out of the spotlight. Human rights organizations cited her in reports as an example of denouncing family abuse. Maggie listened to it, all with a certain strangeness, as she never sought to be an icon or spokesperson. For her, the lesson was simple. No one should accept the invisibility imposed by those who should offer care and respect. In the local community, her presence took on new significance. The same people who had previously seen her as a quiet lady began to view her with admiration. Young people stopped to listen to her when she spoke about patience and strategy, as if her words carried rare wisdom. Neighbor after neighbor began offering to help with small matters, not out of pity, but out of recognition. Maggie felt that her voice, previously ignored, was now valued. Despite all the recognition, Maggie never lost the simplicity of her daily life. She continued to tend the garden with dedication, sharing tomatoes, lettuce, and fresh herbs with anyone who passed through her door. The garden became a kind of meeting place where people stopped not only to bring food but also to exchange stories. This interaction gave her a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced in a long time. Meanwhile, the Haven House Foundation thrived. With the property donated by Maggie, the institution received support from businesses and volunteers inspired by her attitude. Within a few months, dozens of elderly women found a dignified home there, far from rejection and loneliness. Maggie visited the facility regularly, sat listening to the women's stories, and felt that each story confirmed that she had made right choice. Many of them saw Maggie as a figure of strength, almost a silent leader. Some arrived shy, embarrassed by the abandonment they had suffered, but gradually opened up when they realized they were not alone. Maggie knew how to listen, how to give space without judgment. Each conversation was like a mirror of her own journey. She understood their pain because she had experienced it all. This created an authentic connection, stronger than any prepared speech. The newspapers continued to follow the story, but Maggie always avoided exaggeration. When asked about revenge, she responded bluntly, "It wasn't revenge, it was justice. Revenge is to hurt, justice is to correct." This phrase became repeated in articles and debates, further cementing her image as someone who knew the difference between pride and dignity. This clarity lent even more power to her narrative. However, Maggie never stopped reflecting on the loneliness that preceded her transformation. She knew that thousands of women still lived in silence, without support or resources to defend themselves. This thought motivated her to continue helping, guiding the foundation, and raising awareness of the issue. She understood that her story was just one among many, but she also knew she could serve as a beacon for others still searching for a way out. Sometimes she would sit alone in the garden at dusk and mentally relive everything that had happened, from the silent humiliations to the moment she raised her voice. With documents in hand, every detail was part of a mosaic she didn't want to forget. Not as a wound, but as a lesson learned. For Maggie, Remembering was the way to ensure she would never again be reduced to invisibility. This awareness was her greatest triumph. The following months brought Maggie a calm she had never experienced before. For the first time in decades, she no longer felt the weight of being treated like a burden. The house once again became a space of tranquility, where silence wasn't synonymous with contempt but with choice. She would wake early, make her tea, and watch the garden grow, each leaf and fruit a reminder that life could be simple and yet fulfilling. During visits to the foundation, Maggie saw the tangible results of her decision. Women who had arrived shaken, often in tears, now smiled as they participated in workshops, tours, and conversation circles. Some even returned to old talents like sewing, embroidery, and singing, transforming the space into a vibrant home. Maggie sat among them, watching intently, and felt her gesture had multiplied in hope. The respect she had earned was also reflected in the way she was treated outside the home. People who had previously ignored her began to listen to her opinion at community meetings, asking for advice on local projects. Maggie never sought leadership, but her natural poise placed her in that position. She responded simply, reminding everyone that there was no secret. Just listen, wait, and act when the time was right. Her relationship with her son remained distant. He never apologized, and Maggie didn't expect him to. She understood that some recognition wouldn't come, and that the true victory was no longer dependent on it. The void left by disappointment was filled by new connections, new friendships, and the certainty that she didn't need approval to move forward. This freedom was, in itself, a belated but precious gift. With her daughter-in-law, the rift was even more evident. After her social decline, she avoided all contact, fearing being exposed again. For Maggie, this mattered little. There was no longer any resentment, only the conviction that life had placed each person where they deserved. This distance brought peace, because there was nothing left to fight over, no power to claim. The cycle was over. Some nights, Maggie would write in a notebook kept by her bed. These weren't memoirs for publication, but personal reflections. There she recorded thoughts about patience, dignity, and endurance. Rereading her own notes, she realized her life had taken an unexpected turn, and that perhaps that was the most beautiful thing, transforming apparent weakness into concrete strength, without the need for titles or riches. Public recognition continued to grow, but Maggie always preferred to keep her life simple. She declined invitations for more high-profile interviews, accepting only those that could bring support to the foundation. For her, visibility only made sense if it was used to protect other women. Thus, even in the face of praise, she never let herself be dazzled. Her victory wasn't in fame, but in what remained after the cameras turned off. Deep down, Maggie knew she hadn't just won a personal battle. What she had done was pave the way for others to realize that silence isn't submission, and that age doesn't negate the ability to act. This was the legacy she left. The idea that dignity isn't a favor, it's a right. And each time to her garden, harvesting what she had sown, she felt that her life had finally aligned with the respect she had always deserved. Over time, Maggie's story spread beyond her hometown. Reports were translated, shared in other states, and even on international websites. The story of a 74-year-old woman who managed to turn the tables on her own family and transform a fortune into social housing sparked curiosity and admiration. Many saw a universal message that there is no age limit to demanding respect and dignity. Invitations began to come from far and wide, including from international organizations working on aging-related causes. Maggie declined most, not out of disdain, but because she preferred to keep her life simple. She only accepted when the invitation was directly linked to practical support for the foundation. In her view, there was no point in talking about change if it didn't translate into real impact for the women in need. With each visit to the foundation, Maggie encountered new stories of abandonment and rejection. Some women arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs, having been cast out by their own families. Maggie welcomed them calmly, reminding them that she had been through the same thing and that the shame wasn't theirs, but rather those of those who had treated them as a burden. This exchange of experiences created a network of trust that strengthened everyone. Recognition, however, also brought responsibilities. People began seeking advice on family situations, as if she had all the answers. She always made it clear she wasn't an expert, just someone who had lived and learned from her own pain. She said that each case was unique, but that there was a common principle. No one should give up their right to respect. This candor made her words carry even more weight. Meanwhile, her son and daughter-in-law completely disappeared from social life. They moved, abandoned their old circles, and lived in anonymity. Maggie rarely thought of them. There was no more resentment, only indifference. Her life's focus was on the present, on the plants growing in the yard, on conversations with neighbors, and on the work of the foundation. That was where she found meaning, not in the past they tried to impose. With each new achievement the foundation achieved, Maggie was silently moved. Seeing women rebuild their lives, learning new skills, or simply smiling again was like reaping the fruits of patience. Often, sitting on a bench in the shelter's garden, she would watch the residents chatting animatedly and think to herself, "This is what I wanted, to transform pain into protection." This clarity gave her peace. Maggie came to be remembered not only as the woman who defeated the arrogance of her son and daughter-in-law, but as someone who knew how to transform a moment of injustice into a larger movement. Her story inspired debates about aging, family abandonment, and social rights. Teachers quoted her in classrooms, and young people repeated her phrases on social media. What began as self-defense had become a collective reference. Most strikingly, Maggie never let herself be fooled by the heroine label. She continued to tell anyone who asked that she was just an ordinary woman who couldn't stand being humiliated any longer. This simplicity made her journey even more powerful because it showed that it wasn't necessary to be extraordinary to fight back. It was enough to recognize one's own worth and refuse to be treated as less than oneself. The years that followed cemented Maggie's status as a beacon of quiet courage. The Haven House Foundation grew, opening new programs and receiving support from organizations previously unfamiliar with the region. It all began with her decision to stop being silent. For Maggie, each new room occupied by an elderly woman, each meal served, and each peaceful night's sleep offered to these women was a victory that no past humiliation could erase. As she aged, Maggie remained active. She walked in the garden every morning, attended foundation meetings, and closely followed the progress of projects. She never let her age be an excuse to be sidelined from decision-making. This surprised even the younger generation, who saw in her an example of vitality. For Maggie, being present was a way to prove she still had a voice and that she didn't intend to lose it again. In conversations with neighbors and volunteers, Maggie often reflected on how respect is built in everyday life. She said it wasn't enough to demand it immediately. Sometimes it was necessary to wait, observe, and act at the right moment. She didn't speak this as theory, but as someone who had experienced it firsthand. This simple lesson conveyed in her calm words was repeated by those who knew her. It became almost a local motto. Respect isn't asked for, it's earned at the right time. The contrast between her current life and her past was stark. Where there had been once loneliness and contempt, there was now recognition and belonging. The same neighbors who had witnessed her humiliation years earlier now saw her as an example of dignity. This transformation didn't erase the pain, but rather redefined it. Maggie understood that the scars remained, but not as a bitter memory, but rather as a reminder that she would never again allow herself to be invisible. One day, the foundation held a simple ceremony to honor her. There were no grandiose speeches, just women who stood up, one by one, to give thanks. They recounted how they had regained their dignity, how they had managed to smile again, or how they had rekindled forgotten dreams. Maggie listened in silence, overcome with emotion, unable to hold back her tears. That night made it clear that the impact of her decision had reached far beyond her own life. Despite everything, Maggie never romanticized her journey. When someone told her she was a hero, she would reply that she wasn't. "I'm just a woman tired of being humiliated." This sincerity made her story all the more powerful, because it wasn't an idealized tale, but a possible reality, one that anyone could face and overcome with determination and patience. Time passed, but the memory of her turning point remained vivid in every detail of the community. Young people who hadn't witnessed the events knew the story as part of their local identity. The foundation, now self-sustaining, continued to grow, carrying Maggie's name as inspiration. For many, she was not just a survivor, but living proof that dignity doesn't fade with age. And so it was that Maggie, the woman once treated as invisible within her own home, became a symbol of strength and respect. The narrative ended not in revenge, but in legacy. A legacy that showed that silence is not submission, and that even the most patient of waits can become the most powerful weapon. Over time, Maggie realized that her life had taken on a new rhythm. She no longer felt like a burden to anyone. On the contrary, she was now a beacon of dignity for many women who previously believed they were condemned to silence. This personal transformation was her greatest triumph, more than any media coverage or public recognition. At the foundation, Maggie walked among the residents as if she were at home. She often sat at the cafeteria table, ate with them, and listened to stories that reminded her so much of her own. There was no superiority in her gesture, only empathy. Every hug she received, every smile shared, reinforced the certainty that everything she had experienced was worthwhile. There, she wasn't seen as the fragile lady or the burden. She was seen as an equal, a partner in the journey. The press, which still occasionally sought updates on her life, began to focus more on the foundation than on her. This pleased Maggie. She never wanted to be the center of attention, but rather to see her work flourish. Knowing that women found a safe home thanks to her decision was enough. This continuity gave her peace, the certainty that even when she was no longer present, something lasting would remain. In the neighborhood, Maggie became a kind of silent guardian. People sought her out, not only out of respect, but also because they knew her perspective was always considered. When there were local conflicts, they would ask for her opinion, and she calmly reminded them that patience was not passivity, but preparedness. This attitude made her a hard voice, even when she spoke few words. At home, her routine was simple and meaningful. She would wake early, open the windows, breathe in the fresh morning air, and head straight to the garden. The vegetable garden, so often the target of scorn, was now a source of admiration. Street children would stop by to help pick tomatoes and bring fresh herbs to their mothers. Maggie smiled at how this small space, once ridiculed, had now become a community gathering point. The final episode of her transformation happened almost symbolically. At a local event, officials presented Maggie with a plaque in recognition of her contributions to the community. She accepted it silently, with a slight smile, but what truly moved her was seeing women from the shelter come up on stage to embrace her. It wasn't official speeches that marked that day, but genuine gestures of gratitude. For Maggie, that scene represented ultimate victory. It wasn't about defeating her son and daughter-in-law, nor about material possessions. It was about reclaiming something that had been denied her for so long, the right to be respected. With each loving look she received, she understood that she had rebuilt her identity, not as a victim, but as an example of resistance. And so, at 74, Maggie ended a painful life cycle with full dignity. She showed the world that time can be an ally, that silence can be a strategy, and that no one at any age should accept being treated as invisible. Her legacy was indelible, not only in the foundation, but in every person who heard her story and found the courage to also stand up. That last summer, Maggie began dedicating even more time to her garden. The space that had once seemed small and insignificant now symbolized her entire journey. Among the lettuce plants, ripe tomatoes, and sprigs of rosemary, she found the peace she had sought for so many years. Each plant she cultivated was a reminder that even when life seemed to suffocate her, it was still possible to blossom quietly until the right moment to reveal itself. Visits to the garden became a kind of ritual for neighbors and friends. Children ran among the flower beds, neighbors brought baskets to gather herbs, and foundation volunteers dropped by for quick conversations. Maggie sat on a wooden bench, watched the action, and realized she'd never been so surrounded by people who valued her. It wasn't fame, it wasn't money. It was belonging, finally achieved. Her son and daughter-in-law never returned, and Maggie didn't miss them. She had learned that dignity doesn't depend on the recognition of those who hurt us. What truly matters is the space we occupy in the world and how we use our voice. She had used hers at the right time with surgical precision, and that was enough. Now she could live in peace, knowing that her story was not one of submission, but of resistance. On that peaceful afternoon, Maggie picked a sprig of rosemary, took a deep breath, and smiled to herself. She thought about everything she'd experienced, the hidden humiliations, the silent plans, and the day she turned the tables. She understood that silence was never a weakness, it was a strategy, and that her greatest victory lay not in the downfall of others, but in her own ascension. As she closed the door to her house, she felt certain she was leaving behind not just pain, but a legacy. A legacy that definitively proved that time, patience, and memory are the most powerful weapons of those who were once considered invisible